It's kind of a cold day here and I'm feeling kind of blah. So why not just talk to myself? And I was thinking about the question, what do I have to do to create that future? And the future, in a way, is the past, because I feel like I went into this future possible world in so-called mania. And it's a world that's here now, but will possibly be made manifest in the future. So what do I need to do to create that future that I saw in the past? It's a non-linear thing. And I was thinking more about this linguistic relativity. How if I'm a native English speaker, if my brain could all of a sudden be in touch with being a native Spanish speaker, I would experience the world in a completely different way. Or I wonder if it works that way if people learn a second language almost as good as their first. But I'm wondering if this transformation into brain states where one feels like they're experiencing mania is a type of brain relativity. If we have different relative brain states that are relative to each other, in a way we have a relative of ourself. So most of us have relatives or had relatives, at least a mother and a father. But maybe we have these relatives of ourself, different brain states, and we're still the same physical organism, but we're just a different version of ourselves, or a different expression, or a different composition. And I'm not talking about things like multiple personalities. It could be more like multiple positionalities or superpositions of the brain. So maybe I'm not bipolar, I'm bilingual, or I just have multiple brain states. Because bipolar is a word to describe an illness. And I thought of a good phrase. I'm not confused or delusional or hallucinating. I'm non-linear. So I'm back to some stuff on David Bohm in my notes. And I'm reading the book Wholeness in the Implicate Order. So I want to quote a few things that he said to myself, because they relate to what I talk about with myself. He says in chapter 2, clearly the act of apprehending relevance or irrelevance cannot be reduced to a technique or method determined by some set of rules. Rather, this is an art, both in the sense of requiring creative perception and that perception has to develop further into a kind of skill. I think I need to read that part differently at the end. The sense of requiring creative perception and that perception has to develop further into a kind of skill. So having creative perception and also having that creative perception develop into a kind of skill. So right now we're very skilled at thought, so much that it just happens automatically. But we can have creative perception, and I think that happens in map consciousness. But unless we become skilled at it, we're being directed by something that we don't understand, because we act based on our perceptions. So we're introduced to a brain state of creative perception, but it has to develop into a skill. So that's why I quoted that by David Bohm. And for me, it's kind of the art of perception, which is related to apprehending that which is life-affirming. And that alienates us from society, because society is not based on that which is life-affirming. And when David Bohm says in the beginning that clearly the act of apprehending relevance or irrelevance cannot be reduced to a technique or method or determined by some set of rules. Well, the thoughts in our head are often the rules of society and the rules of morality. I should do this, I shouldn't do that. So we're trying to figure out what's relevant or irrelevant based on our thoughts, which is like a set of rules. And so I wrote down, mania changes the algorithm of apprehension of relevance or irrelevance, thus changes our values. It changes it towards life-affirming things and sharing, even though it doesn't seem like that sometimes. And it also changes our language too. A lot of us become very poetic and metaphoric. And the thing with mania too is it's not like we have a new set of thought structures by which to operate. We're perceiving in the moment. It's creative. It's always changing. It's always new. It's rich. And can we turn that into a skill? Can we be skillful at that? Can we be skillful in our rich perceptions and our diversity of experiences instead of just trying to narrow that field back to this narrow societal structure? So that's why I liked that quote too, is because it made me think that mania changes the algorithm of what is relevant and what is irrelevant to us. And a lot of the trouble with when people say, oh, you've changed or something's wrong with you, it's that all of a sudden we think a lot of what we used to think was relevant is now irrelevant. And so we're acting differently and we're thinking these other things are relevant, which could be changing, and it seems chaotic. But chaos is required for the next level of order to come into operation. There's always chaos first. And I wrote down that mania is the mutation. And mutations aren't always selected for. So the universe initiating this process of map consciousness isn't working to transform the human brain because it's being diverted into a medical problem and not seen as transformation, not just for the person, but when the person gets through it, they help to transform people that have yet to transform and maybe lessen the suffering that's involved in going through the process. So I feel like that's why the human brain is having trouble in the younger generation now, because this mutation that happens in, say, late teens, early 20s through this transconscious process is being captured and is not being allowed to flower into what the meaning and purpose of it is. So now it's trying to get to the brains earlier in life. And I feel like if people with labels of mental illness can transform and be healed, that will have a ripple effect that will actually affect, say, perhaps the rates of other conditions. For example, maybe autism. And that's just a little weird hypothesis. It's more of an evolutionary hypothesis of consciousness. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying it could be proven. But I can just sense that it could be possible because the brain is trying to transform. And what is trying to transform out of that structure is recapturing that energy and not facilitating the brain to transform and mutate as it's trying to do. So the evolution of consciousness is trying a different method. And it's sad because it's doing it to the young, innocent children. And we're all young, innocent children inside. So it doesn't really matter what age this kind of thing happens. Something happens to the brain. Something is happening to the human brain. Not, oh, I'm the only one going through this and there's some people going through that. No, it's happening to the human brain in general. And I just got an email about a book called iMinds talking about how technology is changing the human brain. Everything changes the human brain. So which way should it be changing? I've probably only said the word should in all of my talking to myself once or twice, both in this video. And I made a note to read a bit from the top of page 34. And he's talking about relevance and irrelevance. And it can't be a form of accumulated knowledge of properties belonging to statements. So it's not a fixed thing. Rather, in each case, the statement of relevance or irrelevance is communicating a perception taking place at the moment of expression and is the individual context indicated in that moment. So when the context changes, the statement is irrelevant. So in this way, every single thing I have said up to this point is now irrelevant. So I'm not trying to actually make relevant statements. It's just talking according to a certain context. And then even if it is relevant or irrelevant, it doesn't cover all possibilities. So this means that one has to learn more. So it's about learning, creating context, making statements in a certain context and learning from that, because it can never cover all possibilities. And that's why I say that self-dialogue is never ending. And he says, so when relevance or irrelevance is communicated, one has to understand that this is not a hard and fast division between opposing categories, but rather an expression of an ever-changing perception. So to me, mania is an expression of an ever-changing perception. And that can only happen when the ego structures have been suspended. Because otherwise, the perceptions are only changing slightly according to the thought structures, and they're not really changing because we're thinking the same thoughts all the time. So self-dialogue is a flux. And on the top of 47, he says, the noun vidation means an unrestricted and generalized totality of acts of perception. And if you've listened to my conversation with myself, you'll just know why I like that sentence. And on 39, he says, beyond all these orders is that of the movement of attention. This movement has to have an order that fits the order in that which is to be observed, or else we will miss seeing what is to be seen. And to me, when we have our brain operating on the order of thought, it's thinking about something yesterday or the future, and it's not really seeing what is there to be seen. And I think what happens in so-called mania is we actually start seeing what's there to be seen, and it's a different experience altogether. For example, if we try to listen to a symphony while our attention is directed mainly to a sequential time order as indicated by a clock, we will fail to listen to the subtle orders that constitute the essential meaning of the music. And that's what's happening. We're listening to our ego clock tick along, and we're not able to see and hear the symphony of the universe. And so in mania, we get connected with the symphony of the universe, and we can see and hear the subtle orders that constitute the essential meaning of the universe. So I'm just creating equivalent sentences here. Evidently, our ability to perceive and understand is limited by the freedom with which the ordering of attention can change, so as to fit the order that is to be observed. And I think that's what's happening in map consciousness. Our brain is starting to become free to change attention to fit the order being observed, not just observing our thoughts, or not even observing them, but being totally absorbed in them. So can we know when we're around beauty? And can we know when we're being surrounded by thought? And David Bohm talks about the unrestricted flow of meaning. And that's what I'm doing with the self-dialogue, is not restricting the meanings and the flow of meanings that are being created through me. And I feel like through the brains of people who go into mania, there really is an unrestricted flow of meaning. Maybe it only makes sense in the context of the actual person saying it and what they're perceiving in that moment, but it's not actually correct to anyone else, but it's still an unrestricted flow of meaning. Even if a lot of it is wrong in the height of that process, to the person experiencing it, it actually feels really meaningful. So even if one has a thought or says something that is completely out there, it will have this sense, this feeling of meaning. Whereas a lot of times our thoughts just drone on and feel pretty meaningless, and some of them feel meaningful, but usually in bad ways. And then I forget. And that language is an order of sounds, words, structures of words, nuances of phrase, and gesture. So if that's what language is, he says language is gesture. Language is sounds, words. That's why I really feel that when the brain goes into that state of mania or map consciousness, it's getting in touch with a completely different language, and not just as words. And it's still English, but it's still a different language. It's a different dialect. And I think I said that before. We speak a different dialect of English. So mania is a different language order that reorders language. It reorders the brain and the language of the brain and how the brain operates. And it changes our gestures, it changes our nuances, it changes how we use words, it changes how we speak the words. So when he says that that's what language is, so it's a different language order. And he says, something, 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 we can develop rules of grammar and syntax that use this order in a systematic way to enrich and enhance the possibilities of the language for communication and for thinking. And he says we can do that. I think that's what the energy of mania is doing. Not that we even need to try to do it, but there's this evolutionary force doing that. And if we understood it in that way, or some other way than it's now being understood, we might actually be able to harvest that energy and maybe even harvest it better, because I've sort of thought of it as if somebody's kind of like in that state, help them harvest their state. But if we can facilitate that person to actually move through that energy in the way that that energy wants, then it might actually be more fruitful. If we knew what it was trying to do, we wouldn't just sit there and watch someone in that state. We might actually facilitate that happening. And it's similar to what Krishnamurti says, that truth has to be seen moment to moment. And therefore, truth is in perception. It's in seeing. So it's a simultaneous movement of perception, attention, and action. And I wrote down that mania makes many facts liable to collapse. And based on what I just read by David Bohm, so-called facts are kind of contextual and they collapse in different contexts. So perhaps map consciousness is a context that collapses a lot of things that we see as facts from the level of thought, but are evidently non-facts from this other level of map consciousness. And one last bit from David Bohm on 46, he says, "Indeed, as has already been brought out to some extent, every language form carries a kind of dominant or prevailing worldview, which tends to function in our thinking and in our perception whenever it is used, so that to give a clear expression of a worldview contrary to the one implied in the primary structure of language is usually very difficult." So I feel like map consciousness is a different language that is different than the primary structure implied in the English language. So there's the English language and that worldview, and then there's map consciousness, which comes in and changes the way one might use the English language and the worldview seen through the English language. And this part's important too. As indicated earlier, one of the major defects of the ordinary mode of using language is just its general implication that it is not restricting the worldview in any way at all. The ordinary mode of language leads us to fail to give attention to the actual function of the divisive worldview that pervades this mode, so that the automatic and habitual operation of our thought and language is then able to project these divisions as if they were actual fragmentary breaks in the nature of what is. And why that's important to me is because I feel like when we get in touch with the language of map consciousness, we see that there are no fragmentary breaks on the nature of what is that have been created by the structure of our language. So we move beyond those fragmentary breaks, and it could be that perhaps we're using it in a relational way or trying to use it in different ways. There's probably no real defined way. And also, when we go into map consciousness and mania, we realize very quickly, it's very obvious, that we've had a restricted worldview, and we have access to maybe infinite worldviews as the moment changes and as we move through life. So when we're lost in the language structures and mesmerized by that, we don't actually realize that our worldview is being limited. So our language, in a way, is a worldview limiter, and it limits our sensitivity, it limits a lot of things. So this book, Wholeness in the Implicate Order, I've given a few snippets, not with the intention of infringing any copyright, but by quoting as part of this self-dialogue research. And I love David Bohm. He was a genius for sure. One more. We see that the mere act of seriously considering such a new mode of language and observing how it works can help draw our attention to the way in which our ordinary language structure puts strong and subtle pressures on us to hold our fragmentary worldview. And I feel like in map consciousness, we're not just seriously considering a new mode of language, we're living a new mode of language. And we can also see some of the old modes of language and what that does. And when we're in map consciousness, a lot of the times we have a unitive worldview and we see the connections of all things. So we're seeing through that language of interconnectivity and unity and speaking as that. And when we get upset, it's usually because we're seeing the old language and what it's doing and reacting to it, and usually using strong language about that, but it doesn't even come across in a communicatable way that people would really receive because we sense it so strongly and we react so I want to say passionately. So that's it for David Bohm for a little bit. There's probably more notes of him somewhere, but I will continue this later. I don't know if that reading to myself is boring, but if I ever go through and watch my videos, then I'll get to hear those quotes. So it's for me first and foremost, because I don't ever want to go through these notebooks again. But I might actually watch some of my videos at some point. It's just translating what I find interesting and the things that I say into video format. So it's reformatting.